In spite of this, they still sinned and did not believe in his wondrous works. Therefore, their days he consumed in futility, and their years in fear. When he allowed them to die, they then started to seek him. And they returned, and they sought earnestly for God. And then they remembered that God was their rock, and the Most High God, their Redeemer. Nevertheless, they flattered him with their mouth, and they lied to him with their tongue. For their heart was not steadfast with him, nor were they faithful to his covenant. Whatever he does, whatever he gives, whatever he shares, we'll find a way to fix that. What's God done for you? Because if you have a list of things he's done for you, it ought to include your existence. That's been given too. We humans forget. We come from him. He designed us and created us to be with him, his way, not this world. We reject that. We ignore God's design plan for our purpose. And we have to ask ourselves the question, why does God keep going with us? What is it about the corrupt humanity, the corrupt individual humans, the corrupt governments, the corrupt religions, the corrupt educational systems? What is it about that that's beautiful to him? What does he see in the corrupt people, including us? What does he see? Well, that's one of the things we will find out in the kingdom exactly, because the glory that's in a human being that he can see, we can't. But we can see his purpose. That's what happens when you're called out of the 7 billion people. Our physical nature, which is really our enemy, points to a greater lesson in God's purposes for you than why does he allow us? Why does he let us be like this? There's a greater lesson. We can use the rejection that Israel foisted on God in the desert as an example. And by the way, what we just heard was Psalm 78, 32 through 37. And we almost never read that. Psalm 78, 32 through 37, they remembered him. They honored him. When he allowed them to die, they began to hear him. And nevertheless, they went out and fixed that relationship too. Psalm 78, 32. We don't have to turn it. Go ahead and turn if you want. Though our history as human beings of humanity highlights our, what do you want to call it? Fickleness, our frailty, our insanity, our underinformed incompetence. It's more than a study of depravity to take a look at what's actually happening in this world. It's a study of God's mercy. You're breathing, and so am I, because of his mercy. If he was just in everything instead of merciful, we just wouldn't be anymore. The patience of God, the grace he's given, the compassion of the holy toward the profane. All his attributes are amazing. And creation really has to marvel at that. The idea that literally and metaphorically, treasonous, physical humanity has abusively and willfully and intently slandered him in the desert, and we do it now. We are because God allows us to be. We don't deserve that. We must know that God's mercy is amazing. It's beyond our ability to understand how we could actually love our enemies, how we could actually care for those who don't give a whit whether we're on the planet or not, or want us off the planet. But he doesn't act like that, think like that, isn't like that. And the reason is his mercy. Well, where does that come from? We haven't got a long time to get into that, but one thing you can say is that it is the opposite of this world's way. His mercy is about giving, not getting. He gives of himself, he shares himself, and Christ shares himself. God so loved the, you could add a word, sinning world, that he gave his only begotten Son. Jesus Christ gave himself up. Remember, he said, I could take my life back, but I give it. What is this thing about the giving thing? There must be some reason to that. God remembers we are but flesh and hesitates to stir up his wrath and destroy us, because then we wouldn't be, and it would be all over. And he, by the way, unless you say, well, this is just how God is, remember the flood. He destroyed all life except for one family, for one house, as we heard yesterday. God creates for his very good life-sharing purpose for which we are designed. So our first thought is that God's mercy is amazing. It isn't just something that happens because, that's how God is. It's amazing. And why we need to understand it that way is we're going to have that mercy in us. We need to respond to that. Repeatedly, the Israelites sinned against him. If you want to turn someplace, let's turn to 1 Timothy 6. We'll get to that in a second. 1 Timothy 6. They sinned against him repeatedly, and he didn't kill them off. Well, there were a few times when he ceased them from existing. If we're honest, we do the same thing. We repeatedly sin against God. And even after we're granted his Spirit, and we're guided by his Spirit if we'll listen, we follow other guidance. And our own physical being with absolute alarming ease. Still, though, after all the sin and the rebellion, after all the complaints and the rationalizations for the complaints, God remembers that we are but flesh, and he does not stir up his wrath quickly, although it comes. He gives us life from him. We'll see that in a second. He gives us life from him, but it's for him. It's not so that we can continually, forever, throughout eternity, do what we want. He gives us life from him to learn to be like him. So it's for him. And we don't give ourselves in this life. We don't realize what healing or good is from ourselves. It doesn't come from us. There's nothing permanent we can do. We can only manipulate what God's put here. 1 Timothy 6, verse 7. 1 Timothy 6, verse 7. This is the one that draws everyone up short. For we brought nothing into this world, and it is certain we can carry nothing out. And having food and clothing, and with these we should be content. But those who desire to be rich or, rely on the world, fall into temptation and a snare, and into many foolish and harmful lusts which drown men in destruction and perdition. And yet God doesn't stop us. He lets us live. He gives us the opportunity to learn to be like him. And the rest of humanity, he lets them go too. Of course, they get themselves into jams where they destroy each other. So, in a word, God's mercy is amazing. That's our first thought. The second one is that people have taken God's mercy and grace for granted. throughout all human history. See, the problem is, if God's merciful and you break his law and he says the penalty of that is death and you don't die, well, guess what happens? Oh, I can do what I want now. I can pretty much have what I want. He offers forgiveness. We interpret his mercy as license to do what we please. And every human being is guilty of this. Let's turn over to James 1. James 1. We abuse the character of God. When we sin, we abuse the character of God. What he is, we abuse that. And by the way, we abuse what we will be. At least for a time, God allows that. His patience is actually enduring. You go, this must be exhausting for him. No, he's not exhausted, okay? But we would be if we had to do it. If we had to put up with corruption, negativism coming at us and never stopping, it wears you out. But it doesn't wear God out. It doesn't. Think about this a minute. In the midst of all the rebellion, the dissension, the excuses for not obeying him or connecting with him or being of him, anything good and perfect and eternal still comes from him. He continues to bring life. He continues to share himself. He continues, just like we are, to those who reject the truth and us. James 1, verse 16. James 1:16. James 1:16. Do not be deceived, my beloved brethren. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, and it comes down from the Father of lights. Yes, both some things come from my employer. No, they don't. Everything comes from God that has eternal value, with whom there is no variation or shadow of turning. He's never going to change this issue. Of his own will, he brought us forth by the word of truth, so that we might be a kind of the first fruits of his creation and his creatures. The reason we know this, the reason we understand that all good and all permanent and all eternal things come from him, the reason we understand that and others don't, and no good comes from anywhere else outside of this life, so there really isn't any good here, it comes from God. The reason we understand that is so we can be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. That's what that says. Okay, so the first thing is God's mercy is amazing. The second one is we take it for granted. And the third thing is that God's mercy allows us to become as he is. If it weren't for that, we just wouldn't be anyway. Have you ever wondered, have you ever thought, it allows us to become as he is? Have you ever thought that you've sinned past the limits of God's mercy? That you've done so much you can't pray to him, that he won't hear you, that you can't be forgiven? Have you ever thought that? Because you know, that thought's given to you by other than God. Think about this. If the wanderers in the desert didn't provoke the destruction of this planet, he can put up with you and me. We haven't exhausted his mercy. In all of our futility and all of our struggles, as we hold on to the knowledge of all-wise God guiding us, he remembers that we are but physical, underinformed life, and he will never leave us. That's Philippians 1:8. He will never leave us. You don't have to turn there. He won't leave. And since this place that we're in, this planet we call Earth, is actually a setting for his family, this place. You say, well, how do you know that? Well, number one, no matter how hard they try, they can't find another one like it. This is a setting for God's family. Boy, if we could just find another Earth, we could prove there's no God. Because, you know, this is where God wants to work with humanity, and that's all just a fable. No, it's not. This is the setting for God's family, and it was made good, and when people were made, that's very good. Who owns it? Well, Satan is the god of this world, so he owns it. Nope. He doesn't. We don't have to turn there, and you'll see why in a second. But in 1 Corinthians 10:26, it says God owns this earth and the fullness of it. The reason you'll see why not to turn there is that's not a complete quote of the Old Testament. It's not. It's incomplete. We'll go there in a second, where it really is and what it really says. But understand this, and this is really important. What's God done for you lately? Allows you to be, allows me to be, and he owns you. God's mercy is amazing. We take it for granted, and it allows us to become as he is because he gives it to us. And he wants us to learn and insists that we learn to do it too. Psalm 24. We are owned by God. Psalm 24. Every moment of our life, every thought we could have is given the opportunity to learn to be like him. A philosopher once said the easiest way to keep yourself in line in a civilized society is to remember you have death on your shoulder, that every moment you could cease to exist. Well, that's partially true. Knowing from moment to moment you have death on your shoulder, that's partially true. What the rest of it is to know that you also have life on your shoulder. That from moment to moment, you choose life. That's what God said to do. Psalm 24. 24th Psalm, first verse. This is what 1 Corinthians 10 is quoting. 24th Psalm, first verse. The earth is the Lord's, and all its fullness, the world and those who dwell therein. God owns the earth, everything in it, all the interdependent systems. Oh yeah, by the way, as an added-on attachment to that fact, he owns you. And actually, in the church, we just finished saying, I agree with that. We took in the physical life, the attitude of sacrificing our physical life as a living sacrifice by eating the body, the symbolic body, consuming Jesus Christ's physical approach. Then we took in and drank what happens afterwards, which is today. The life of Christ in you, the unleavened Christ, his spirit life was drained out of him. You know, the life is in the blood. There is no offering without blood, no sacrifice, no fulfillment without it. The bottom line to that is the redemption comes through only Christ. He owns you. He and the Father are making you over into a new creature. And oh, by the way, that isn't taking the old and making it into new. It's making a new one. Our great Creator, our Father, through Jesus Christ created you, is creating you, brought you forth from the womb, as David said. He is of all life, and he desires that we become, as it says in 1 John 3, as he is. So the next time you think, I don't think I can just stomach this world, the negativism, the horror of it, think this. God looks at it differently. He says, I want you to look at the misery and the suffering and the corruption of it and see the beauty. Think on these things. See? Why would he be like that? Because he sees what we can't. He sees what we aren't yet. He sees it in me. He sees it in you, which is astounding. But I know why I can say that and get away with it. He put it there. Not me and not you. Whatever is good, whatever the purpose is, it comes from God. Whatever good and right and permanent comes from God, comes down from him. And who proved that? Who proved that we can share life as Christ all the way to the end of our life? and then not cease to exist. By the way, service and sharing of yourself hurts sometimes. It's uncomfortable. We're spent. We're worn. We're beat up. We're exhausted by it. And God says, keep going. Present yourself a living sacrifice. And you go, well, I don't have any more life in me. Okay. Well, God will renew that. He says that. Who proved it? The one who went all the way to the end. And he's alive. He was literally raised by God. Christ proved that to you and to me. As designed by and for God, he gave life to a complete sacrifice, a perfect sacrifice. And we are to be living sacrifice and give ourselves completely up. God grants you to take your life and hand it to him and not be in charge of it anymore. You must be responsible and follow his directions, but trust that he knows where he's going when he called you into the desert. Don't rebel like they did. Do it even now. God's mercy allows us to do that. It's amazing.